Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the final player review of the season for the San Jose Sharks. And with this video, we will finally be able to close the book on the depressing 23-24 season and begin to look ahead to bigger, brighter, and more exciting things to come in the future for the Sharks in the 24-25 season. But before we can get to that, we must discuss who I believe to be the most disappointing player on the team this past season, and that is Alexander Barabanov. Now, in my last few player reviews, I've discussed players like Kevin Labanc, Luke Kunin, Kyle Burroughs, Kalen Addison, and while each of these players were disappointing in their own right, what they also all have in common is that the expectations for each of them really weren't all that high. When it comes to Labanc and Kunin, at best, they were expected to be decent third liners, but more in that fourth line range. Kyle Burroughs, a third pairing defenseman. Kalen Addison maybe slightly higher than that due to his offensive flair, but still in that third pairing range. However, there was no other player on the roster who had a bigger difference between what was expected of them and then what we actually ended up getting performance-wise than Alexander Barabanov. It was a couple of years ago when the Sharks picked him up in a trade with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and near the end of that season, he'd played just a few games for the Sharks and look really good, be a point-per-game player, which would end up earning him a one-year, $1 million prove-it contract with the San Jose Sharks. And prove-it he did was good enough that even with the change that the Sharks would undergo that very next offseason with bringing in a new general manager in Mike Greer and a new head coach in David Quinn, Barabanov would get yet another contract with the Sharks, this time 2 years at $2.5 million per season. And he quickly earned the favor of new head coach David Quinn and found himself as a constant in the San Jose Sharks' top six. He ended up with a 50-point pace over a full 82-game season, and coming into this year, it was expected that we would get more of the same from Barabanov. Perhaps we even took for granted that he would be an easy pencil in to the San Jose Sharks top six, and instead we were more so worried about how the defense would look, how the new players would adjust, how Willie Mecklin would do in his first full season. We thought Barabanov would just be a very, very easy player to have repeat his performance, maybe slightly lower in terms of points just due to the departure of Erik Karlsson, who was a player who had tied the offense together. But what we actually ended up getting was a very far cry from that. Like I said, expectations of a top six player, but the performance of barely a fourth liner. If we take a look at his stats, 46 games played here, he did miss a decent amount of time due to injury and illness. I believe he had like a broken finger at some point. He was also, if I'm not mistaken, dealing with a COVID illness as well. And so it is very possible that these injuries and illnesses had an effect on how he actually played, even when he was healthy and when he was in the lineup. But it is difficult to actually predict just how much of an effect that may very well have happened. I can't really say that. I'm not connected enough with Barabanov to actually know that for sure. And so I can actually only strictly evaluate what I saw in terms of his on-ice play, and what I saw was really, really bad. In fact, his 46 games played was not only because of injury and illness, but also that he was a healthy scratch a couple of times this season, and not undeservingly so. There were multiple games this year in which Barabanov was actually the worst player on the ice for the San Jose Sharks. And so I was actually in agreement with David Quinn when he ended up benching Barabanov a couple of times this season. Had you told me at the beginning of the year that Barabanov would be a healthy scratch a couple of times and yet Luke Kunin would be in the lineup every single time he was healthy enough to do so, I would have called you crazy and I wouldn't have believed you. And yet that is the world we were living in during the 23-24 season. If we take a look at his offensive stats, 4 goals, 9 assists, 13 points, that's about a 25-point pace over a full season, pretty much half of what he had last year, which is just such a massive fall off. I talked about how, with Erik Karlsson gone, you're expecting maybe a slight deflation of points, but at the same time, you're also on a team where there's not a ton of offensive talent. You're finding yourself either in a top line role or on a second line role, and somebody does have to do the scoring. The Sharks are going to score at least a goal or two in every single game that they play. It's why Mikael Granlund ended up getting 60 points. It seemed as though Barabanov would at least be able to be a slight beneficiary of that, and he'd get to the 40-point mark, and yet he was a far cry from that. And this is not because of a lack of opportunities. His most common line mates this season were Tomas Hertl and William Eklund, two of the best players on the San Jose Sharks. His second most common line mates were Mikael Granlund and Fabian Zetterlund. So David Quinn gave him these chances. He played him with these really good players, the only good players on the Sharks, and yet Barabanov was always the weakest link on those lines. He was always the issues on this line, and he was the reason why those lines never actually found any sort of success at all. In previous seasons, Barabanov was a pretty good playmaker. He had really good hands, great stick handling, and he had some decent offensive instincts as well, reminiscent to a former San Jose Sharks who was a fan favorite, Jonas Donskoy, the type of player who's not really elite and putting up 70 to 80 points in the season, but the type of guy who can surprise you on a game-to-game basis with their creativity and what they are actually capable of. But we did not see that at all from Barabanov this year. Instead, his stick handling, which was on display in very few games this season, usually just left to giveaways over and over again. And instead of being a step above the play, he was actually a step behind it instead. And so it was a large drop-off from what we were expecting offensively from Barabanov. But that also bled into the other part of his play. Now, defensively, Barabanov has never actually been all that great. He's been serviceable enough in the past to still be good enough to play in a top 6 role, but with his offensive game dropping considerably this season, his defensive play also saw that same drop-off. But since it was starting off from already a barely average point, it ended up with him being a massive liability on the ice. I talked about his most common lineup being Hertl and Eklund, and his second most being Granlund and Zetterlund. On both of those lines at even strength, those lines only managed to generate a single even strength goal and were instead just massive minuses when they were on the ice. Barabanov individually was a minus 24, which over a full 82 game season would have him in the negative 40s, which is indeed indicative of just how bad he was at even strength offensively and defensively. There really weren't a lot of positives, if any, to take out of Barabanov's performance this season. If we take a look at his time on ice, 15 minutes and 52 seconds, you might be thinking, well, that's not that terrible, but it's important to point out indeed that at the beginning of the season, David Quinn thought he had a solid top 6 player, and so he was getting the 18, the 19, sometimes even above 20 minutes of ice time in games in which the Sharks were desperate to try and get a goal. It was only as a few months would pass that David Quinn began to realize that Barabanov was not nearly the type of player that he had in the previous year, and so that ice time began to go down slowly. There were even a couple of games where he didn't even hit the double-digit marks in terms of minutes. I imagine that if the Sharks had actually, or if Barabanov had actually played closer to an 82-game season, that downward trend of ice time would have continued and he would have dropped to perhaps even below 15, perhaps even to below 14 minutes, because by the end of the season, he was a third liner at best, but mostly in a fourth line range, barely getting much time on ice at all. And so when it comes here to Barabanov, coming into this season, in fact, it was expected that he wouldn't even finish the year with the San Jose Sharks because he would get traded at the deadline. He seemed like a shoo-in for being moved as a rental player for a different team because he was on an extremely affordable contract of $2.5 million, and he was a 50-point player. Sure, he didn't have any playoff experience, but you can't really, 50-point players don't grow on trees. That would be a big pickup for whichever team, and the Sharks wouldn't even have to retain any salary to actually make it happen. But because of how bad he actually was, he became an unmovable player for the San Jose Sharks, and this offseason, the Sharks haven't bothered to actually re-sign him, which makes sense with the window that they are actually targeting, but I don't believe any other team has actually bothered to re-sign him as well. I do think that if a team does decide to take a chance in the NHL and he doesn't end up back in the KHL like he was a few years ago, they'll probably be quite happy if indeed it is the case that the illnesses and the injuries were actually holding him back and he's able to get back to that 40, 50-point pace. Whatever team actually ends up getting him will be quite ecstatic with that, but his time with the San Jose Sharks definitely came to an end, and it's disappointing how it truly ended for him. And so when it comes to his grade, I have some decent, fond memories of Barabanov back in his better years for the San Jose Sharks, so I didn't want to give him an F for this season, but he came very close to that and ends up with the grade of a D-. Class dismissed.